Hi, everybody. This is Tana Meyer with OCEANetwork, and we are so just blessed and honored to be able to chat with you today and to talk with TJ Schmidt and Faith Berens from HSLDA. And thank you guys so much for joining us. And if you could just introduce yourself a little bit and your roles at HSLDA, and then we'll dive into some questions. We're going to specifically be talking about homeschooling special needs and, some encouragement and tips for doing that, and then also Oregon homeschool law. So TJ, go ahead.
Well, Tana, thanks for having me. And both Faith and I are certainly excited to be here with you and with OCEANetwork families. But my name is TJ Schmidt. I'm one of the staff attorneys here at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I've had the privilege of working at HSLDA for over 19 years. And for most of those years, as an attorney, staff attorney for Oregon with HSLDA. So I'm looking forward to our event today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be on here. Thank you so much, Tana, for having us. So I'm Faith Berens. I'm one of HSLDA's special needs consultants, and I've had the blessing of being a part of HSLDA since 2008. So coming up on 14 years, and I work part-time. I'm a homeschooling mom of two, and I get to serve members across the nation just with educational questions and support.
That's wonderful. I know you guys have been such a blessing to Oregon homeschool families, so we're just thankful for the time that you've taken to chat with us. So I'm going to just launch into these questions, and if you guys have any questions for them, go ahead and ask in the comments, and we'll make sure we get you guys an answer. So the first thing I wanted to ask was, when a lot of people right now are just thinking about getting started homeschooling, especially special needs parents. So when somebody's just thinking of getting started homeschooling, what are the first steps that they need to consider?
Okay, great question. I know TJ is probably going to say, well, first of all, look at the law. What are your requirements in your state? So I'm going to let him jump in, and then I'll come back with some encouragement educationally.
Sure. Well, whenever you're thinking about homeschooling, obviously one of the questions is, what do I need to do to get started? And I think Faith's going to talk about some of the practical things. As far as the law is concerned, obviously if your child is a certain age, if they're compulsory school age, they're required to begin reporting. That would be 6 by September 1st. But the law in Oregon, your child would be considered to be in first grade when they're 7 by September 1st. And that's important because of the testing requirements. And we're going to look at that a little bit later on with the PDPs, or privately developed plans. But in Oregon, it's just a one-time notice. You report to your education service district. And if you have any trouble in figuring out who do I report to, where that is, obviously you can talk with OCEANetwork, with your local homeschool support group, or of course here, those of us here at HSLDA.
Okay, great. So then some of the steps that I usually encourage parents, just from a practical standpoint, besides obviously figuring out what their requirements are, is to plug in with their state association. Obviously, we would want parents to partner with OCEANetwork. That's a great place to get support. Obviously, they can turn to us at HSLDA for support from the educational consultants for teaching tips, strategies, help with curricula planning, or oftentimes students who are diagnosed with a disability, they will have typically a test report from a psychologist or a neuropsych. So sometimes parents or if parents have pulled out of public school and the student has had an IEP, they often don't know where to start, and they have this test report. So one of the things that we will do is review the test report for the family in order to make recommendations specific for the child based on the child's strengths as well as their weaknesses, and really help the parents develop plan, because our stance is that homeschooling is an individualized education plan. So we want to help them create something that's customizable and doable for them in their particular situation. So getting support, be that through you all, through the state association, also tapping into maybe some online support groups for homeschooling families to try to connect them so they can get support, or even trying to connect them to find a private evaluator or a therapist or a tutor that they may need in their state. So the support is necessary and obviously beneficial. And then making sure that you try to plan from a strength-based or interest-based, tap into the student's strengths, and then lining up therapy. So typically I'll encourage families to incorporate some type of therapy as part of their private plan or their home education plan. And also helping them find the curricula and then planning, like teaching strategies. So it's really helpful for students with special needs to have multisensory teaching, hands-on teaching, and a specific curricula that's going to be a good fit for the child. But sometimes parents don't know where to start, or they're overwhelmed because there's so much curricula and so many resources now to choose from. So, but those are some steps for success. And then also the assistive technology and helping to implement accommodations in the home setting. So I think those are some practical ways to set the student up for success, as well as the primary teacher, who is typically mom, but sometimes dads are teaching too.
That's great. Thank you. So I was curious, how do you, and I know this question comes up a lot in our Facebook group especially, how do you find curriculum specifically for special needs students, or do you just adapt what's out there? And are there resources that are created just for them?
You can certainly adapt. I mean, there's really no one size fits all curricula, and oftentimes for kiddos with special needs, it is an eclectic approach that can be really helpful, because often our struggling students or our kiddos with some type of learning disability, they'll have gaps and scatters. For instance, my daughter was always really high in reading, but much lower in math. And so getting a curriculum out of a box where I'm gonna order the third grade curriculum from this curricula provider, and that's gonna work. That never worked for us, and for a lot of homeschooling families with special needs. So choosing something at the right level for reading, and then choosing something at their right functioning level for math, and then maybe piecemealing together, for your content areas. But there's certainly some really good curricula providers that are specific for special needs. So All About Learning Press, The Logic of English, IEW has some really great resources for struggling learners or kids with dyslexia. BJU Press Homeworks, I love their DVD driven or stream resources. There's some, Woodbine House is great for kids with autism or deaf students or Down syndrome, woodbinehouse.com. There's some really good curricula for practical skill development, like Skill Trek, or if you have a child on the autism spectrum, there's a company called Rethink Education. It used to be Rethink Autism, now it's Rethink Education. Austin and Lily and Matthew C. is wonderful. And then a lot of families find Alpha Omega Press, the Switched On Schoolhouse, works really well for visual learners or kids on the autism spectrum too. So there's a lot out there now, but some of it's maybe not as well known in the homeschool realm. So, we're happy to help parents find the curricula or resources that would be a good fit for their child.
Well, I think just one thing real quickly that, I'm glad Faith pointed out is, you do have the flexibility to teach your child according to their level and according to their needs. I think sometimes we hear from parents who, if you read carefully the Oregon law, or they look at the testing requirements in particular, because as most of you know, your child has to be tested at third grade in the third year and fifth grade in the fifth year. And again, the first year would be when they're 7 by September 1st. So those testing years normally are when they're 9, 11, 14, and 16. That's according to the law that they have to. And so sometimes parents think, oh my goodness, I've got to be teaching, the fifth grade when they're 11, or I've got to be teaching the eighth grade when they're 14. Um, and, you know, there are certainly doesn't mean that you have to using that set curriculum for that particular grade. We're going to be talking about the PDPs, and I think that's why it's so important for parents who have special needs who are not going to be, all maybe at the same grade level. And I don't think any child is ever going to be at the same grade level in any subject, but particularly with children with special needs, this is very, very important. So I'm glad Faith, focused on that, and we're going to talk more about the PDPs and how to avoid the kind of the top end, the testing issues that may come up with some of those issues.
Okay, great. So a couple of the questions we had were relating specifically to ADHD and dyslexia. And you, Faith, you gave me some resources that I can share with everybody about that. But I'm curious if you have any other thoughts about those two specifically, how people can teach students with those challenges.
Sure. So, well, for ADHD, I have one of those. Lots of wiggle breaks, keeping your lessons short and very, very specific. So I talk to parents about having brief spurts that are really targeted instruction, maybe a 15-minute mini lesson, for grammar or something, and then get up and take a break or do something that's hands-on, and art or nature study or something like that, and then coming back and hitting the next segment of something that has to be more focused, like spelling, a short spelling lesson and practice, and then getting up and moving again, doing something different. They practice piano, or we go outside, we jump on the trampoline and we review math facts, and then we come back in and eat lunch, and then we'll do math later. But so lots of breaks, multi-sensory instruction, utilizing visuals. Also just knowing, really, parents know their kids best. So knowing what issues trigger that attention. For my daughter, she couldn't have background noise. I mean, the littlest noise, the dripping of the faucet or the this or the that would drive her crazy. However, it was really interesting. If she put music on, that would help her focus. So every person is different, and we all have different learning styles and ways that we like to work. My husband can work well with background noise, with a TV going in the background. I can't. So chewing gum actually helps people focus, peppermint. So I'll talk to parents about ADHD or ADD. Typically, it's recommended for kids to be put on medication. Well, we didn't want to put our daughter on medication, and a lot of families don't. So looking holistically, lots of water throughout the day, healthy fats for the brain is really helpful for attention, making sure that you work with a doctor, a nutritionist, a certified nutritional health consultant, because oftentimes some of the contributing factors for ADD and ADHD are vitamins or nutrients that we're deficient in, like vitamin D or magnesium, zinc, stuff like that. So looking holistically and planning to help your student by looking at the nutritional piece, diet, exercise, lots of good sleep, obviously cutting down on screen time, which does interrupt and impact our attention and focus. So those are some strategies, but and there's lots of other tips on that handout that you'll be providing as well. I don't know, TJ has lots of kids at his house. Maybe he has some ideas.
Well, I will say that my wife does the vast majority of the work, and so maybe sometime we should have her on. But A lot of what we do, I think as Faith has said, it's you just have to find what works for your child. And, I know those at OCEANetwork and our consultants at HSLDA have a lot of great resources. There's some on our websites, and, just talk with other people around you. And, I think that's often a very effective way of trying to find what works or what may work for your child. And if you can get your hands on some of the material, I think that's why, if your local support group has maybe a lending library or maybe a friend can show you some things. Oftentimes, I think it's really helpful to parents to actually be able to, look through the materials.
Okay, thank you. So let's dig into a little bit of the homeschool law side of things. I know one of the main questions that parents of special needs in Oregon have is how to handle the evaluation time and the standardized testing time. So I'm going to just briefly let you guys know what those options are and then turn it over to TJ. But you can also go to the OCEANetwork.org website for this information, and feel free to contact us anytime if you run into any issues or have questions. But basically, when it comes to evaluating special needs students, in some ways it's very similar to non-special needs students in that you have to have evaluations done at 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 10th grades. But the difference is that you have some more options. So students or parents of special needs students have 3 options. The first one is you could just go ahead and take the standardized test. And some parents do choose to do this because you, in Oregon, you are required to get above the 15th percentile. And so a lot of special needs students, depending on the challenges, can do that. And so even after, if you go below the 15th percentile, you still have a year to work with your child and retake the test. And a lot of times at that point, then a parent will choose a different option. The other options you have are, the second one is the IEP, and that is working with the school district for services and creating this IEP plan. And then the third option in Oregon is meant to be a frugal and low intervention way to evaluate special needs students, and that is called a PDP. And that is the one where I think there are the most questions about how to do the PDP, how to select a service provider, things like that. So TJ, can you expand on that?
Sure, absolutely. So there's just a lot to cover, and I don't want to bore people with all the, intimate details of these requirements. But, I think one of the key things is obviously under Oregon law, when you're looking at testing, those testing just has to be done according to a child in a particular grade. And so if your child doesn't fit into that mold, then I think I would suggest looking at alternatives. Now, there's nothing that prohibits you from, trying out a test before you're required to. So for instance, in 2nd grade, you could certainly test your child and see how they do. As Tanya mentioned, that the requirement is that you score above the 15th percentile, at the 15th percentile or above. And so for many children, even if they have a learning disability, maybe they'll be able to, through your teaching and training, have learned different tips to kind of overcome some of the challenges. And so many, in fact, more homeschool children than you would expect often can score at the 15th percentile. But still, there's always going to be children that are not going to meet that. And so there are alternatives on that. Would be developing a privately developed plan or going through the public school system. Now, real briefly, the public school system, anyone is entitled to an evaluation. So if you want your child evaluated, you can do that. You can have them evaluated through your public school. I would suggest that you do it in writing. They have a certain period of time once they receive a referral or request for an evaluation, and the school district then would be required to do that evaluation. Because Oregon, could provide services, some school districts do, some don't. There's no law that mandates everything that they must provide. They just have to consult and discuss and offer at least a free, appropriate public education. So that's not the route that many parents decide, but it is available to you. And I just, certainly if you have more questions, feel free to follow up with us. Many parents, though, who are privately educating their children focus on also privately evaluating their children. And there are obviously costs that are involved. One thing that both Faith and I are very pleased to be able to, refer you to is HSLDA Compassion. And that is kind of our way in which we can help families who are homeschooling through hard times or with various challenges. And one of the specific funds that we have would be for special needs families. We've got individuals who've donated money specifically for families who need that extra help and assistance. So, check with HSLDA Compassion if you have a need for an evaluation and you're not able to financially provide for that. There may be a way we can help you in that area. But in getting the evaluation, um, you just need to either have an IEP or have a private evaluation, in our opinion, to be able to kind of take that first step for the PDP. You don't have to show that evaluation to your education service district. You don't have to get their approval. You don't have to do any of that. Although some of the education service districts, particularly, I don't want to necessarily name names, but Lynn Benton Lincoln
Yeah.
and Lane ESD typically have a little bit of a harder line on these issues. That's not to say that you may not have an issue there. You may not, but just be aware that they often have a little bit harder line. I would always check with OCEANetwork, with HSLDA first. Um, it's not a problem for you to reach out to your education service district or even your local school district, but just be aware that they may not always be telling you the best or the most accurate information. So once you get the evaluation, the PDP is kind of setting up your goals and objectives. The one thing that I tell parents is Oregon law doesn't limit what you do for your child. There's no restrictions. Now, for some parents, they want to know step by step exactly what they need to do. And we can certainly point you in the general direction, but the law is very free in that you get to determine what's best for your child, what's best for your family. But that privately developed plan is going to address obviously your goals and objectives for your child. And then also it needs to address how they're going to be evaluated for the assessments that are required in grade 3, 5, 8, and 10. And again, in Oregon, that's the third year, the fifth year, the eighth year, and 10th year. And that first year again is when they're 7 by September 1st. So if your child is entering a school year where they're 7 by September 1st, that's first grade. So the grades that they would be tested normally or evaluated would be 9 by September 1st, 11 by September 1st, 14 by September 1st, or 16. Those are the grades that your PDP is going to be invaluable in laying out how the child is going to be evaluated.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. So,
Yeah, and can I add
sure.
something? Or I like what TJ said about and I think you touched on it too, Tana, that um if you wanted to give a standardized test earlier when it's not required and just keep it and see how the student does, yeah, like TJ said, so many students are able to test fine, and some of them do well with basic accommodations if they have a diagnosis, and many of the test publishers will allow for accommodations for disabilities, things like extra time or time and a half, or reading aloud certain sections, as long as it's not like a reading decoding portion of the test. But so those are some questions that we can help navigate too about accommodations on testing. But I think a baseline assessment, even just for our own information as parents, can certainly be helpful.
Okay,
No,
great.
I really appreciate that. I mean, that's a very good point, Faith, because in Oregon, obviously, it just has to be a neutral, qualified evaluator, but there's nothing that prohibits you from giving an accommodation if you have an evaluator or an IEP that gives your child accommodations under the testing. Most test providers and administrators obviously can provide those accommodations in accordance with your specific evaluation or the child's IEP.
So here's a question from a mom. She said, I would like to know how to best lay a strong legal foundation when homeschooling or testing in an ESD that is not in favor of homeschooling or specifically homeschooling special needs.
Well, I think there's so many ways to kind of approach that, but I would definitely make sure that, if your child has special needs and you're at all concerned about their testing, if you've tested them maybe in a year early just to see how they would do, to give you and your child a little bit of breathing room and not to be maybe as such a high pressure or high stakes evaluation. Um, and it's no don't worry about it. We have every year almost, maybe a child who scores below the 15th percentile. That doesn't mean that you're going to be prohibited from homeschooling. There is automatically, under Oregon law, they have to be tested or evaluated again. If your child falls in that situation, my first suggestion is immediately develop a PDP so that you can get yourself out of having, to continually do that annual testing. Theoretically, you could be required to test up to 3 years in a row. After the third year, the ESD could recommend that the child be enrolled in public school. But our goal, obviously, and I know OCEANetwork's goal is we never want to see a parent in that situation. So being prepared, I think, is the best way to kind of help protect your homeschool program. And so, maybe doing that initial foundational baseline testing just to kind of give yourself an idea of what you might expect when they are required to do testing. If you don't want to expose your child to have to do those kinds of testing, again, work with Faith, work with OCEANetwork, work with us here on the legal team to develop that privately developed team. And again, as I said earlier, the law is broad enough that you can, with your private service provider, determine what's best. And we kind of didn't really go into the whole nuts and bolts. I think, Tamara, you might be talking about that or asking that question just a little bit, but um, there are ways in which we can help you be prepared and review your privately developed plan with Faith. I know, she'll probably talk about that in just a second, but we can help you in making sure that you're prepared in the event that there's any kinds of questions or pushback. Um, but I never want parents to, kind of have to be facing the point where they're submitting a test result that's, maybe under 15th percentile, and now they're trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? Obviously, if you're in that situation, please contact us. Remember, testing would be by August 15th. So there's no harm, even if a parent say to decide right now, your child is in third grade, or your child is in fifth grade. They're 9 years old, or they're 14 years old. They're at a testing year, and this school year was that year that they had to be tested. You go ahead and say, oh my goodness, I've got to go test. It's June. You could go and get a test now, have your child test, and if they do great, great. You can submit them, and there'll be no issues. But if your child scores below the 15th percentile, you still have time, and we can still help you in developing that privately developed plan and getting you set up so that you don't have to necessarily submit a low test result right now. So again, while you have to be tested by August 15th, there's no harm in you doing it early, and many parents do it now when they're ending school, and that way they have time to still plan ahead. So I'm sure Faith probably has some information about maybe this question as well.
Well, I mean, most of the questions are that I get from Oregon or our team gets is what has to be included in the PDP? What are the parts of it? We do have a sample. We call it a student education plan, but that's just broad for every state or for any state if a parent wants to develop a written plan. But I mean, TJ touched on it. You're going to have goals and objectives for your students. I typically recommend families will list the accommodations that they're providing at home, appropriate accommodations based on the student's diagnosis or their difficulties. Maybe listing assistive technology that they're utilizing in their homeschool, or specific therapy or interventions, or even let's say the student has dyslexia, then probably a good thing to put on the plan is the curricula or the intervention that they're utilizing would address the specific areas of difficulty. So that's one of the main questions is, well, what all has to go on it? So.
Right. And we at OCEANetwork, we definitely recommend that if you're doing a PDP, that you get an HSLDA membership for that consulting key, and also just in case you run into any roadblocks. And of course, we're always available to help too, but we always recommend that if you're getting a PDP, you join HSLDA. And when you get a PDP, you have to have a diagnosis, correct? You have to have a diagnosis in order to develop your PDP. And you have to find a service provider. And the service provider needs to be somebody who's not related to you or related to your child, and somebody who understands the special needs of that child, and can help you develop this plan and put goals on it that are achievable each year. And then they will, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but they will actually do the evaluation during those evaluation years. And the evaluation is really, a lot of times it's just a satisfactory or unsatisfactory. You met the goal or you didn't. And my understanding is that you keep those evaluations, those simple evaluations, on file if your ESD asks for them. Sometimes they'll tell you when you send in your notification, and you've told them you're doing a PDP, they'll say, you need to send us your evaluations during evaluation years. And sometimes they don't, but they might ask you, during that evaluation year. But you just keep them on file in case they ask. I think those things are really important to remember too. One of the questions we get a lot, and that I'd love to hear from you about, is how do you find a service provider that can help you with that? Because there are no guidelines other than it has to be somebody who's knowledgeable about the PD or about the challenges, can help you develop a plan, and isn't related to you.
Yeah, so I'll probably let Faith answer more technically how to find a particular service provider. But so the PDP team is the parent or parents and at least one private service provider. And while it may be better or more recommended to have someone who's not related by you, as long as it's not the parent, technically someone who is related to you could be the private service provider. There's no prohibition against that. The only thing that would be technically prohibited would be as if you're doing a standardized achievement test, then that person has to be neutral and qualified. So it can be a little bit confusing in that area. But the private service provider, as far as, from a legal standpoint, could really be anyone who's working with you. We would recommend, obviously, that someone who's got some experience or qualifications in that. If they are a educational consultant or a school psychologist or some other, qualified individual. And if you have any questions about, well, what, is this person going to be qualified? A lot of it is going to be, unfortunately, is going to be kind of the perception of what the Education Service District. You never have to submit the qualifications or approval. You get to determine who those individuals are. But if you're concerned that there's going to be perhaps some scrutiny, again, I think the best way to protect yourself would be is to have somebody who has a little bit of qualifications appropriate to your child's needs, that you can say, well, look, we have a PDP team with a qualified individual, and this is what they've determined. And one thing before I turn it over to Faith that we kind of touched on real quickly here is the fact that when you're doing these evaluations, you have to be doing them in the 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 10th years. But you do not necessarily have to submit them. It's only if your ESD requests it. So whether it's the standardized achievement test or the PDP evaluation, you never have to submit it unless it's requested. I would say Lane and Lynn Benton Lincoln, they're going to always request it. But some of the other ESDs across the state don't always request every year. And so you may do the evaluation and you just have to put it in your files in the event that you are requested it later on. So I would turn it over to Faith to see more practical ways in how you can find somebody to be that private service provider and or evaluator.
Sure. So HSLDA does have a listing for members. We have a database. We call it our Find a Professional tool. So that's a database of evaluators, tutors, psychologists, some therapists that we've developed over the years and we keep adding to. So people can contact us to find somebody in their state. SPED Homeschool is a national organization that was started by Peggy Pluhar, and I serve on their board. They have a listing as well. They have private professionals listed there. You can check with national and local charitable organizations to find services like the ARC, Scottish Rites, Easter Seals. Oftentimes, your own therapist that you may be working with privately, like a speech and language pathologist, or maybe it's a dyslexia tutor. So there's lots of associations that of therapists, national associations. So if you're, if you're already working with a therapist, that person could serve as your PDP person. So, networking through, again, that's why I always encourage families to have support through their national organization and the local and state, because you can network. We actually found through our homeschool co-op, which is based out of a church, that they have a private school, but they also have a university model co-op, that we could utilize them to kind of be our oversight and do our standardized testing or do our portfolio or letter. Because in Virginia, we can do either standardized testing or have a letter of progress. So those, networking through co-ops as well, you can probably find somebody that would be qualified. So those are some ways of finding people.
Okay, great. And we had one more question. I think we've kind of gone through this a little bit, but I wanted to clarify. So the question was, who can sign a PDP, and what do you do when your school district rejects your PDP? And this question came from a mom who wanted to make sure that this was clarified for everybody, because she was in one of those districts we mentioned and ran into some issues when a relative was the service provider. And so again, we highly recommend, if you're using a PDP, to join HSLDA and use them, consult with them, reach out to them for help, especially if you run into any issues like that. And as far as the school district, my understanding is that the school district has nothing to do with your PDP, that they have zero involvement with your PDP. The ESD is the one who may request your evaluations, but they don't even get your PDP plan necessarily. They just get the evaluations during evaluation year if they request it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And, that brings up, this question and scenario brings up a lot of great points. One thing that I would say is, I mentioned kind of earlier, is a lot of times when you reach out to the education service district, you're expecting them to maybe give you the best or the correct answer. And I'm not trying to denigrate any public school official or education service district, but many times they're thinking in the context or mentality of a public school, kind of focus or mentality, and it doesn't always necessarily fit with private homeschooling. And the law doesn't require you to provide your PDP or to get any kind of approval on who it is. If you're concerned that your education service district is going to give you a hard time, again, contact us here at HSLDA. Let us know. We can even write a cover letter with your evaluation, because again, you can go through and select your private service provider, develop your PDP team. Excuse me. You can complete your PDP, determine what your evaluation is, and then all you need to do is, when your education service district requests it, submit your alternative to the standardized Schmidt test. And so if you're concerned that, oh my goodness, this is the first time that my school district is even knowing that my child has special educational needs, that they have a disability, how can I kind of approach this subject? We can work with you, help you with a cover letter Or of course, if you would like us to get involved, we could write that cover letter as well. And so that may help in kind of smoothing the way for your first evaluation. Many parents, though, if your child was in the public school system, they already have an IEP, the school district is going to know. And obviously, one thing that we didn't kind of mention earlier on is if your child uh, has a disability and you know that they have a disability, you should notify this in the notice of intent. And I apologize, I should have mentioned this before, but for many parents, you begin homeschooling. If you're homeschooling right from the get-go, and after a while you realize, I think my child's just not grasping, maybe math, or there's a particular issue that they're struggling with. Um, if it's not a known disability that's obvious, then they may not know until after they've submitted the notice of intent. And so again, it really depends on how they do for testing, whether you need to notify them. If they do have a disability, you do need to notify the Education Service District of that, but it could be right up until you submit the evaluation. It doesn't have to be, years in advance if you're, still trying to feel out your child and see, um, what exactly they're struggling with. So again, talk with us. We can help you in all that transition. But if your ESD does, kind of push back or does give you a hard time in these, obviously, again, contact us. I would let OCEANetwork know as well so that we can kind of work together in these scenarios. OCEANetwork has a great team of long-standing leaders and advocates within the homeschooling community. Those, who've been here in Oregon for years and years and years, and they've got a lot of um, historical knowledge and context that I think can be very, very helpful. I know that in the past, I've worked very closely with many OCEANetwork leaders in addressing specific problems. And so we can help you in navigating all these situations, regardless of what the Education Service District is telling you. And again, regardless of the needs of your child, what you are facing, both OCEANetwork and those of us here at HSLDA are looking to assist and help you do the best that we can as you do the best that you can in educating your child at home.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And so before we wrap it up here, Faith, I was just wondering, we've provided a lot of information, a lot of legal information and options, and I really just also want to encourage parents of special needs students that they can do this. And so I wonder if you would just give a last comment of encouragement and tips or whatever you have for us before we sign off.
Yeah, sure. Gosh, encouragement. I just want to encourage parents that they are their child's best teacher. They know their children better than anyone else. They want to see them succeed more than anybody else. They can do this. They don't have to have special training. That's one of the things I hear a lot is there's so many families, particularly with kids on the autism spectrum and dyslexia. We're just seeing those numbers rise, more and more people pulling out of public school to homeschool because of those specific diagnoses. And that's one of the things I hear is, but I don't really have special training. So, sticking close to your tribe, having that support and also working closely with therapists and just learning, being a good observer of your child, what works, what doesn't work. But it's not rocket science, giving them a good schedule, love and encouragement and the direct instruction. We're just seeing the benefits and students with special needs just thriving at home with home education because of love, encouragement. They get more time to sleep, more time to be outside. Parents have the freedom and flexibility to plan around their child's strengths and their interests and to teach them. I think this is one of the most important things, to teach them at their developmental level, not forcing them to be in a box or be somewhere where they're not. and really teaching in that, it's called the zone of proximal development and education ease. It's just teaching the child right where they are in their sweet spot, where it's not too hard and it's not too easy. Lots of time for rich conversation and encouragement and love. That's what makes the difference. And that's why I think students with special needs are thriving at home.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you both again so much for the time you've taken to join us and just talk with us and encourage us and give lots of information. For those of you watching, if you have any questions, don't forget you can ask in the comments. We will find an answer. We'll, tap on the shoulder of TJ and Faith again, or we'll talk to the OCEANetwork Freedom Watch team. So don't be afraid to ask your questions. We are here to help you. We're here to serve, and we're privileged to do so. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.